Hey everyone, it's Naomi Wolf. I'm presenting This Week in Congress this week, and this is what happened. It's Sunday the 13th, it's Mother's Day, and we're looking back on the week that was. So I'm standing in for Isaiah Thompson, who has finals. So I will summarize what you've missed. The big story is that the balanced budget amendment passed the House. And what this means is that public debt won't increase. Of course, the balanced budget amendment makes sure that the outlays and the income balance out. But what this public bill does, it's a debt bill. It holds that, quote, the limit on the debt of the United States held by the public shall not be increased unless 3/5 of the whole number of each house shall provide by law for such an increase. However, there is a waiver, and the devil is always in the small print, which says that Congress can waive the provision if a declaration of war is in effect at any year when the United States is engaged in military conflict which causes an imminent and serious military threat to national security and is so declared by a joint resolution. So basically, this allows, to give it a cynical reading, lawmakers to say, look, we passed a balanced budget bill, or a balanced budget amendment rather, but there is this loophole that you probably wouldn't know about that says, oh, but by the way, if we declare war, it doesn't have to balance. And the other thing is, we don't even have to declare war, we can just be engaged in military conflict. So that's a pretty subjective definition. Certainly of war, but also, they lowered the bar. It doesn't have to be war. It can be a statement, a joint resolution that there's a serious military threat. And then that kind of negates the balanced budget amendment. And that is HJ Res 2. And that was agreed to in the House by a vote of 111 to 111. So having said that, how can you have a balanced budget amendment if the deficit is up? Well, the Congressional Budget Office let us know that the deficit is up by $71 billion. So it's $598 billion short of balanced, according to the Congressional Budget Office, which is objective and nonpartisan. So really just think about that. Republicans are in power. We have a Republican president. We are nonpartisan, but we're just noting that the Republican position is limited government spending. And in fact, according to this neutral budget office, the outlays for the first 6 months of this year are $97 billion higher than they were last year. So that's a lot of checks flying out of the government's checkbook. So in case you've ever sat around thinking, well, wait a minute, I know there's a balanced budget amendment, and yet there's all this spending. How is that possible? Now you know how it's possible. Some really interesting things have happened to move on in banking and finance. In fact, that's where most of the activity this last week has taken place. So there was a repeal of the Volcker Rule, and that's HR 4790, which was the Volcker Rule. And so the current law has been amended to let the Federal Reserve Board of Governors be the sole authority for determining the extent to which banks can engage in the trading of securities, derivatives, commodity futures, and options. So that was voted on Friday. That's pretty huge. And what that means is that the Fed basically gets to be the only authority regulating commerce in America having to do with securities, derivatives, commodity futures, and options. No other regulation. It is the Federal Reserve Board. So what a lot of people don't know, but more and more people do know, is that the Federal Reserve Board is actually not a government entity, and it's quite non-transparent. It's a private entity. And you can't look up its books. You can't really look up its proceedings. It's not a transparent entity. But for now, you should know that the proposal is that this private, not checkable, not answerable entity is the sole authority for determining the extent to which banks can engage in the kinds of practices that resulted in the bubble and collapse of 2008. So that's pretty huge. Bank stress under HR 4283. This is another deregulation of banking and financial institutions. It used to be that banks and financial institutions had to report twice a month on their ability to withstand financial stress. In other words, are they over leveraged? Remember that word leverage and how it played out so often in the crisis of 2008, too big to fail, these banks collapsing, with a domino effect. It was because they were overly leveraged. They couldn't withstand financial stress. This bill says you get to do that again. We've learned nothing from the devastation of the collapse of that bubble, is what critics would say. Supporters would say banks shouldn't be regulated. It's capitalism. You're taking a risk when you engage in any contract with a bank. And I guess people in the middle or just watching might want to remember that when those big banks went down because they were over leveraged, so did a lot of people's mortgages. A lot of people lost their homes, a lot of foreclosures, and a lot of retirement accounts wiped out, gone. So this proposal says, well, if you're a bank, you don't have to report this twice a month. You only have to report your ability to withstand financial stress once per year. So that passed the House. And what I really want you to think about, and I say this every time pretty much I do this week in Congress, what's the last year been about, the last week rather, an adult film star, payments to an adult film star, Giuliani messing up, payments to an adult film star's disclosure, a lot of smoke and mirrors, certainly children being separated from adults at borders. That's a very real issue, of course, but emotive issues, right? Coming from the White House. White House spokespeople being upset about being made fun of at the correspondents' dinner. And the effect is everyone in America, with the exception of very few people, are looking over there. And they're not looking here. And this is where all the action is. And what you didn't know, probably, because pretty much no one reported it, and they guarantee that no one will report it by being so boring, huge sections of our economy were further deregulated, very much affecting you. It was all about the banks and all about, spending more without accountability. Bank supervision. So this is HR 4061. It's the third of the three giant banking bills that passed the House. HR 4061 requires the Financial Stability Oversight Council to consider the appropriateness of imposing heightened prudential standards as opposed to other forms of regulation to mitigate identified risks to U.S. financial stability, passed the House. Well, what are prudential standards? They are not as rigorous as other forms of regulation. So this is basically saying, this bill is saying, instead of other forms of regulation from third parties, we're going to just have the sole form of regulation be heightened prudential standards, which I understand to be not external, not third party, mostly voluntary. So that's what happened. I mean, when you combine HJ Res 2, which allows Congress to say they balance the budget, but also to spend whatever they want, basically, if they say that there's conflict. You add up $71 billion over last year spent, right? And you add up these three bills, and I'm going to say them again, HR 4790, HR 4293, and HR 4061, that vastly deregulate banks, right? Vastly create the context for another bubble and collapse like 2008. You're really seeing an amazing economic situation, which is kind of plunder, right? It's like spend all the people's money, take the people further into debt, and at the same time deregulate banks so that people have really very few protections as consumers or as people who hold retirement funds or mortgages. And we're nonpartisan. You can decide if that's a good thing or you just can decide if it's a bad thing. It's certainly deregulation and free markets, right? But it's also this double-edged thing. It's on the one hand, very free markets with no regulation. On the other hand, a huge amount of public spending, a huge increase in public spending without the accountability of a balanced budget amendment. There were other bills that were introduced. HR 4921 would secure data in the Department of Transportation for their information security system. So that's good. I think that's a transpartisan good thing. The idea of InfoSec, informational security, data security, is, more top of mind with legislators. Managing safety data, another one. HR 4925 would require the Federal Railroad Administration to develop a plan to protect safety data. So good, right? But they're not really bread and butter issues. They're not bad, but they're not like jobs, schools, roads, right? Environment. HR 4203 extended 5 years to the maximum penalty for stalking minors. Not a bad thing, certainly transpartisan, appealing. Most people are not going to say that's a bad idea. It passed the House, but no one's expending a lot of political capital on it. No one likes online stalkers of minors. And human trafficking banking, HR 2219, also passed the House. And this requires recommended methods to combat money laundering as it's related to human trafficking. So good. Human trafficking is bad. It's a transpartisan bad thing. But is it our most pressing concern? The problem of money laundering, which is overseas overwhelmingly, right? Related to human trafficking. It's not a bad thing for America to be doing. I don't think anyone would say that it's great to have human trafficking and people laundering money made from human trafficking. It's bad. But of all the problems facing America, it's very, very interesting to me as a cynical person, former political consultant. What I see here is that huge meat and potatoes went into public spending, vast public spending, and vast deregulation of our financial institutions, and then a few kind of not terribly impactful but appealing or cosmetically attractive bills were thrown out there so that these guys and girls can go home and say, you know what, I voted to stop stalking of minors. I voted to stop human trafficking or make these more serious. And the last thing that did pass the House is aid for Ethiopia. So HRES 128 condemns the killing of peaceful protesters and the excessive use of force by Ethiopian security forces, the detention of journalists, students, activists, and political leaders who exercise their constitutional rights to freedom of assembly and expression through peaceful protest, and the abuse of the anti-terrorism proclamation to stifle political and civil dissent and journalistic freedom. That passed the House. So it's not actually aid for Ethiopia. It's more of a statement opposing Ethiopian crackdowns on civil society. And again, who's going to object? We like freedom, at least in principle, and we stand for democracy overseas, at least in principle. I guess a lot of people watching this would again say this is another one of those bills that doesn't cost anyone anything in terms of negotiating or reaching a compromise with the other side, or real deliverables for the American people. Right? All the bills except the banking bills really gave stuff to not the majority of the American people, right? Human trafficking is mostly overseas. Minors, of course, you want to protect minors at home. But Ethiopia, it's important, but is it really the most pressing issue facing, mom and dad stores, small businesses, teachers, firefighters, military families, people struggling to pay their student loans, people struggling to buy a home or pay their rent. I don't know. I would say it doesn't seem to me that this week in Congress was really focused on bread and butter issues for ordinary Americans. But in any event, this is Naomi Wolf. That's thisweekincongress.com. We're going to put all of the bill cams of these bills on Daily Clout, and you can then tweet the bill sponsor, tweet the representative. These bills it's not the end of the story. If you don't want to deregulate our entire financial system, you can tweet the bill sponsor, tweet your rep. You can put a stop to it. If you do want to deregulate it. You don't want protections on, I need to say this in a very nonpartisan way. If you think it's great that banks have fewer regulations, which I'm sure a lot of people do, you'll want to know about these bills, and you'll want to, tweet the bill sponsor and tweet the representative to say, good job, love it. If you care about Ethiopian aid, definitely use that bill cam, support Ethiopian journalists. If you think that our lawmakers have more urgent things to take care of at home, where protesters are, some critics would say, not assembling freely, not being kept from police brutality. We have our own protest movements here at home, like Black Lives Matter. Let these lawmakers know. If you think that we should be $97 billion more in debt in the first 6 months of 2018 than we were last year with a different person in office, well, let the president know, let your elected officials know if you think it's really a good amount of money to have spent and that you're getting what you want. Let those lawmakers know as well. Let your elected officials know as well. It's Naomi Wolf. That's This Week in Congress, and thank you so much. This is Daily Clout. Please become a member, support the work we're doing so we can keep you informed. Bye-bye. Have a great week.